Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think it's about 6 o'clock, so we'll make a start. I'm very pleased to welcome tonight's speaker, Monica Stenzel, who is a second year research PhD student at Leeds University. Monica tells me that she comes from the northeastern part of the United States and is thoroughly enjoying living in Yorkshire. Her talk tonight is entitled Fuzzy Logic, and it's about the history of wool science in Leeds. So I hand over to Monica now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then oh, is this what we want? We had it before. This is what you get when you leave tech up to historians.
Need to click on this.
Oh, that's right. The little minimums, give or take. All right. What did I do? All right. Well, I have no idea how I'm showing up on camera, but hello, good evening. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. As he said, my name is Monica Stenzel. I feel very at home in Leeds because actually Stenzel is my married name. My name is Leeds, which strangely enough is how I even found the university. A few years ago, I thought, I know there is a city of Leeds. I wonder if there's a university. I think it would be fun to buy a bunch of Christmas presents for my family. And so I did that. And as I got looking at the programs offered, I thought, those are some pretty good programs. So lo and behold, when I decided to return to school to do my PhD, after teaching in America at universities for about 15 years, I've taught both music history and history. And then COVID hit and I thought I want to do something different. And so I asked at many schools, and Professor Jamie Stark at University of Leeds wrote right back and said, this is a great idea. Send me all your materials, let's get started. And I had never seen such an exuberant response from an academic before. So I thought, that's the supervisor for me. This is my second year and I'm really, really enjoying it. What really motivated me to address wool, and of course Yorkshire is really the only place to study wool, is the idea of sustainability. I was teaching a class on traditional materials and processes and tools to undergraduate science majors, figuring they need a history class to graduate, and where's all the money? It's in science. So I figured I would keep my job, give or take. And what was very interesting to me is that many of the students did not understand the qualities of materials and how to best use them, because really in most developed nations, we have decided the answer, for those of you who have seen The Graduate, is one word: plastics. We answer everything with plastics, and now we know many of the dangers and hazards that plastics have caused. So being a bit of a knitter, and realizing that I read a peer review journal that microplastics now cross the placenta barrier. And so now people are not even born without plastic literally in their bloodstream. So when I thought about what material do I want to study, I thought wool. Let's look at some of the early research on wool and see if there are qualities that people have forgotten. The answer to that, quite simply, is yes. There are many qualities about wool that I have learned, and I share, much to their dismay, my friends and family, and they don't know those things about wool either. I do also hope to make a better impression tonight than perhaps some of my more famous compatriots. But I feel the bar is pretty low. So I'm rather confident that it can only be better than that. All right, so to the talk. In particular, this is part of the starting of my PhD thesis. The range of it is what I'm calling traditional knowledge. What did people know about wool before it went into the scientific laboratory, which is actually a lot. And then tonight's presentation goes through that. And then as it starts to go into the laboratory, what do people find and what do people do? And there's some interesting things that happen. So I will get to it. Maybe. Okay. Thank you. There's so many clickers. There we go. Wool science. I also discovered that I don't say wool correctly because nobody knows when they ask me, what are you studying? I say wool. So I'm working on my Yorkshire pronunciation. What is wool science? Wool science is the analysis of physical and chemical properties and applications for wool. A couple of things to think about here. There's many different forms of knowledge and many different ways to gain knowledge. So I believe that the best way to get a comprehensive knowledge is to join all of these sets of knowledge together, and that they're all valid, and that people who study and represent these different forms of knowledge should perhaps talk to each other. Now, there's a problem with that. There is a historical disjoint. It's somewhat contemptuous between the agricultural sector and wool and the scientific communities. And this is clearly demonstrated with some rather spicy primary sources, my favorite kinds. The 1800s, well into the 1900s, and there's even a few now that are pretty spicy. Problem number two, there's a remaining disjoint between these two communities. And these gaps between these communities are stopping the flow. There's laboratory research on wool, there's scholarly discussion and historical research, but there's also modern supply chains, considering the markets, considering users, and none of these people is really sharing what they know about their sector with anyone else. And there's also quite a problem with wanting to know what is going on in those other circles, because it's all part of the problem. So the kind of knowledge I'm calling traditional knowledge, but still quite valid. What did people know about wool through use and observation? So wool, so far, anthropologists are people who study the very long ago, excuse me, believe that people started using wool around 12,000 years ago. That's quite a while. They have actual samples from about 10,000 years ago. I also find this is a little bit funny. As a historian interested in sustainability, I've seen some people saying wool isn't sustainable. I'd like to know what their time frame for sustainable use is, if 12,000 years is not long enough. So what did they figure out by using this stuff? Well, there's three types of fiber on most kinds of wild sheep or undomesticated sheep. Kemp, which is a long kind of brittle fiber. There's hair, which is much closer to like a human hair. And then there's wool, which is the fuzzy stuff, which in wild sheep comes in the winter, a soft downy wool, and then is shed in the spring. And that is still true of, for instance, mouflon sheep, which are around Turkish and the Caucasians, but also bighorn sheep in America are very similar. People talk about the hand feel, like how does it literally feel? If you're going to make your clothes out of this, you would like it to feel nice. And what did it do? Well, it felted, it spun into threads. It has a different kind of interaction with dyes. than plant fibers. And many anthropologists feel that the first fibers used to create human clothing is probably linen. That's called a bast fiber. There are a few other kinds of bast fibers. And those of you who know about linen know that it's great for the summertime, but also it wrinkles. And it always tends to be sort of bland colors. And there's a reason for that. The plant-based, cellulose-based fibers don't interact with dyes well, but wool really took the dyes. And as I see from a smattering of oranges and reds, color is very, very important to people. And there are even laws during the Middle Ages about what colors you were allowed to wear. The sumptuary laws, which were not only what sort of textiles, who was allowed to wear silk or wear ermine or wear fox or wool, but also who gets access to color. So, and that is still a very strong presence at the university today. There's a whole institute of studying color. All right. Of course, moth proofing. How do you do that? For a long time, people just realized that you could only deter moths. But it isn't until later when we get into wonderful mothballs do we get into a chemical killing the moths, it's sort of a deterrent. Also, how does wool react to heat, moisture, strain, and torque or twisting? It's quite different again from these plant fibers. And so people figured out, well, what is wool good for? Those inherent qualities, and then you can blend it. Actually, one of my favorite blends is cotton wool, sublime. And then how much? Is it mostly wool or mostly cotton, or can you blend it with linen? Wool and silk, amazing. Yeah. So how did sheep get to Britain? Well, they're not native. So like rabbits, the Romans brought the sheep around 43, largely for food. People think that sheep were largely raised for food first, and then fiber and dairy second. So the Cistercian monks, and I'm sure you all know Kirkstall Abbey, founded in 1152, raised sheep. And largely what was happening from about the 800s well through, the 1300s, is that England and other countries here in Britain grew sheep for wool to export, largely into Flanders and the Netherlands, also into Italy, where they would process the wool into beautiful, gorgeous fabrics, largely woven, which they would then sell back to England. And people thought that that was a little bit funny, but as an American, I'm pretty well versed in colonization and then a fabric going back to England and then being sold back to American colonies. So of course that was cotton in a couple hundred years later. The Cistercian monks were called white monks because they didn't dye their wool, and this was seen as kind of an aesthetic choice. They were not indulgent in color. So again, there's that idea that color is important and very desirable. Okay. Wool as a starting material. What did they really know? And I just somewhat arbitrarily picked 1500, kind of the beginning of the early modern period or the exploration. We know that wool is warm, even when it's wet, which if you talk to people who spend a lot of time outside, even in the cold and the rain, they will tell you even now that wool is the only option. Another in my cohort, she is studying polar explorers. And so we trade information about how they had to have wool. For instance, if you are wearing cotton and you fall through the ice, you will probably die of hypothermia because cotton retains that coldness. It's always cold, but wool, you'll probably make it. So it can be down to a life or death situation. So that's important. It absorbs moisture without feeling wet, which is also quite nice. The term plastic originally was not a noun, right? It was an adjective, and it meant that it stretches. But the great thing about wool is it's not just plastic, it's elastic. So it goes back to shape. Wool can be bent thousands of times before the fiber will break, which is many more times than other kinds of fibers, whether they are natural or synthetic. It felts, which can be a good thing, which means that it's shrinking and it's matting. Wool fibers have kind of like scales, a bit like fish scales. And when they get heated up and when there's dampness and a change in the pH, they will link with each other and make a thicker, matted, and even waterproof fabric, which some people still use as tents today. It's great for coats, it's great for hats, it's great for blankets, very warm. And the oil that comes from sheep is called lanolin, although there are many other names in the primary sources like yolk, because it is about the same color as egg yolk, or grease, or there's a few others, but they're all quite colorful. But today they just call it lanolin. If you spin in the grease, the term is you don't scour the wool, you just spin it greasy, it'd be quite waterproof. Okay. Also, something that's really in the news now, and I'm glad about it, is that it's flame resistant. So people are now starting to talk about using it for insulation because it doesn't burn. And unlike fiberglass, which is usually wrapped in plastic, if, sadly, your building catches on fire, the plastic around the fiberglass will burn and give off toxic fumes. So, maybe your house doesn't burn down, but maybe you're not going to last long enough because of the toxic fumes. So one of our big applications we're excited about now is the fireproof. Also, it has much less lint than cotton, for instance. And you may know that one of the reasons that cotton was manufactured, produced, milled in the north of England is that it's very damp here. And that is on purpose because cotton generates so much lint that the factories were quite flammable. If you lit a match to have a cigarette or smoke a cigar, you could blow up the whole building. So that's a lot to consider. Not so much with wool, although there was quite a lot of research at Leeds about de-electrifying the fibers. So my father is from north central Montana, which is quite cold and quite dry. And of course, we used to scoot around on the rug and shock each other. We were just doing research. Okay, so as a finished product, what did we know? You can spin it into very, very thin threads. It does come in different, like they call it a staple, how long the fiber off the sheep. And the very long staple, that is spun into very thin threads and makes our gorgeous worsted fabrics that we have. Shorter ones that are a little bit fuzzier, you can spin into thick, rich, lovely, they call it top or thicker yarn. So from one single material, you can get this huge range of widths of applications. It makes a strong cloth. And eventually, when we get up to knitting, which doesn't hit Europe for quite a long time, people have found knitting, of course, they find everything in ancient Egypt, but people think that knitting probably didn't come to Europe until about the year 1000. But once they figure that out, obviously, it's very squishy and very flexible, unlike woven fabric. Null bounding is a technique that gives a stretchy fabric very similar to knitting, but it's more just like sewing loops and loops with a single needle rather than two sticks putting them together. And as I mentioned, it took and retained dyes much better than plant fiber. I recently read something that I cannot verify, that the reason that many, many flags are red, white, and blue is because those are the dyes that took in white wool. Blue took well, and red took well, and okay, white. So that gets us pretty far with flags. Okay. So all of these kinds of old-fashioned or traditional or folksy or whatever you want to call this knowledge, they use the same kind of observations and applications, but they have different names. And this is something that I am really learning is as you go from these different groups, talking to people in agriculture, people in laboratory science, historians, or even practitioners, they might all be talking about the same thing, but unless you know their word for it, it's literally like a different language, hopping from these different discipline nomenclatures, which I think we all have kind of a sense of that going between work and our home or what you studied in undergrad. But here it just seems really profound. Another layer on top of that, of course, is just actual differences in language. So people may have figured out felting in one part of the world, and they've not figured out felting in that same way in a different part of the world, but they have different names for it and the different ways of spinning, different ways of weaving. So how do you bring it all together? Well, about in the 1800s, science starts thinking about wool, which is very late if you think about that. The 1800s, we're really well into the Industrial Revolution before anybody really starts to bring wool into a laboratory. One of the more fascinating bits that I saw is in the late 1700s, the Royal Court of France commissions a fellow to look at spider silk. And can we turn that into a textile? Mixed results. So what they have found, and what's quite funny is just about 10 years ago, I saw in Chemical Engineering News, which is a peer review science journal in America, looking at, again, golden orb spider silk. It makes this gorgeous, is literally gold. It's like the stuff of fairy tales. A gold silk that is fantastically strong. It's fantastically lightweight. My favorite quote is something like, in his research, he writes, well, the textiles that we generated, they were able to generate a pair of gloves. Is beautiful, strong, lightweight, all these wonderful features. But the spiders, when kept together, are combative and ornery and cannibalistic. And I think about those poor postgraduate students that had to go in and milk spiders. That's not my job. That's why I'm a historian. So we're going to think about bringing wool in, but we're not real dedicated to it yet. So during 1800s, Germany, which is actually not quite Germany yet in the early 1800s, of course, and America began to manufacture specifically for a world market, not just domestic sales. So what are they going to sell? Well, what does everybody want? You want to make stuff that people want to buy, you know, weapons and transportation. Each country kind of focused on something a little bit different. Britain worked a lot on metals. We're looking at ships, railways, swords, guns. Germany has a huge focus, and still today, on chemistry, particularly pharmaceuticals, synthetic dyes, and of course, poisons. America, being a really big place with a lot of money, worked on a little bit of everything. So a few books come out, and we see that they're largely tied to that agricultural side. So if you want to improve your wool, how do you do that? Largely, people felt that the improvement was through breeding, that was the only way that you were going to change the quality of the wool. And certainly through selective breeding is how people came to have woolly sheep rather than the wild sheep that have the kemp and the hairs. The woolly domesticated sheep we have now, they don't shed, and they must be sheared regardless of whether you're raising them for wool or for meat or for dairy. And this is one of the big problems, and it's certainly true in Britain, but also America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Argentina, any major place that's raising wool, is that shearing must be done by a skilled person, and it takes a lot of time. And so it costs a lot of money. And often what the price that they can get for the wool will not even cover the cost of the shearing. And so it's just the cost of doing business. They lose money on shearing their sheep. And this is one of the things I'm most interested in. Certainly it's true. Actually, I'm from the Northwest. I'm from the state of Washington. So Seattle and then come inland a little bit, but a lot of the farmers there have told me, I have a barn full of wool, I don't know what to do with it. Pendleton Woolen Mills is quite close to my home, but even if they can cover the cost of shearing, selling that wool to Pendleton Woolen Mills will not cover the cost of their gasoline to get there. So many people are just landfilling it. Okay, so we're not up to like a sciencey thing. We're still living in kind of veterinarian agriculture. Really the first big book to come out, German, 1825, Ribbe's Das Schaf und die Wolle, the sheep and the wool. In 1844, Spooner's The History, Structure, Economy, and Diseases. I know you're riveted of the sheep. Many people do reference the Hewitt sheep, their breeds, management, and diseases. And then in 67, the wools of commerce, commercially and microscopically considered. What's really important here? Many and science. I also find many of the images quite enchanting, and in stressful times before supervisions, yeah, they might turn into coloring sheets. I don't know. Okay, so we're sort of poking at it. We're going to achieve everything we need through breeding. Well, what if we knew more? There was a real, and even now actually, strong understanding that sheep are great to raise if you live on terrible land, because sheep will eat anything and they still give you wool. And then people, of course, over time realized, oh, well, sheep don't actually like to eat anything. They do have preferences. And if you give them better food, they will give you better wool. Who would have thought? And then I just went to a meeting over the holidays with the Washington State sheep producers, and they were talking about quality of soil. And so this is still something that's getting out there just now, is that if you have soil with a certain sort of pH, certain kind of acidity, a certain amount of loam or sand or other qualities, you may have to remediate that soil to get good fiber from your sheep, because they are what they eat, just as we are. Okay, so now we're gonna take it out of the field and into the laboratory, maybe. Okay. In the mid-1800s, there were a number of world expositions. And the one in Paris, I believe, 1867, people brought all of their items of manufacture. And the English who went felt that they had had a very poor showing, that they were shown up by France and, of course, by Holland, and maybe even by those upstarts, the Americans, gross. And they thought, are we failing? Wool is our thing. Wool is our national identity. We can't fail on wool. And this idea spread across many different kinds of disciplines and many different kinds of areas, called declinism. Oh no, we're losing the empire. We have to step it up. So how do you make things better? Well, from about the mid-1800s until, I don't know, mid-January of this year, the way to make everything better is through science. So let's get that. I'm fine. It's fine. I'm that little dog in the burning house. It's fine. We're going to make it better through science. Okay, so here's our friend, Dr. Bowman, and he is our own true Yorkshire lad. 1885, he is both a chemist, he is a PhD chemist, microscopist, but also he had worked in woolen mills. And so he writes his book, The Structure of the Wool Fiber, in relation to the use of wool for technical purposes, yada, yada, yada. But he says at his introduction a couple of interesting things, that he is a unique person to write this book because he does have both that practical, you might say traditional knowledge, but also the scientific, learned, university level kind of knowledge, and that is quite a rarity. Of course, most people don't go to university. Well, even now, most people don't go to university. And certainly I know that in America, it wasn't until after World War II and the GI Bill that any substantive amount of people went to university. So most of your people working in the mills don't have that level of education, and really no way of getting it. So here's a really unique sort of fellow. He writes this book. It's based on a series of lectures that he was asked to give, speaking to the Bradford Technical College. And they asked him first to speak on cotton. And he said, sure, I'll do that. And he gave 5 lectures. Then he published a book of those lectures. And he felt that that was pretty easily done. Like, here's cotton. We know a lot about cotton. Some of the primary sources that I have seen indicate that cotton went into the laboratory because Western Europe starts to use it much later than wool. Wool had already been used for thousands of years, but when cotton comes in from India, it's coming into Europe about the same time that we have what many people call the scientific revolution, and we're getting into the early modern period of exploration. So cotton is sort of coming in with science. But wool's already been there. We're not going to analyze that. Just, go put it on the bed. Go get your hat. So this is something new. He's asked to do something with the wool, and he said, I had to start almost from the beginning. Like, nobody else has even done this, especially in terms of manufacturing. So he acknowledges those other books we looked at with this kind of agricultural point of view, but he's going to break out the optics and the microscopes, and he's going to start talking about chemical structure and that it's keratin and that it has scales and how it's all affected by pH and all these kinds of things. Something else going on, in 1910, the Textile Institute is founded in Manchester, which, of course, Manchester focused largely on cotton, but also we have the alpaca from Salford. We have people trying to get a homegrown silk industry in Britain, and of course, wool. And so all of those are being supported through education and through research for the Textile Institute. Did I just do that? Okay. Then in 1918, an important year, the British Research Association for the Woolen and Worsted Industries, quite a mouthful, most people just say WIRA, is incorporated in Leeds. Oh dear. We love color. So focusing a bit on Bowman's book, which is part of my PhD thesis, is looking at as really the start of wool in the laboratory, wool in science. So what does he want to look at? He knows that there are different kinds of wool, and again, looking at their different applications. How long is the staple? How much crip does it have? What color is it? White wool, strangely, has kind of an internal mordant, which is a catalyst for dyeing. But colored wools don't. They don't dye as well, but also they already have color, so you can use them as brown or gray or black wool. Some people do over dye them, but the white wool is the moneymaker. He wants to reduce the wasted material, because obviously everything you waste, if that could be used for something else, then you could make money on that as well. The processing, he sees a lot of waste there. And one of his big ideas is that he sees through this whole process of, you go from shearing, and then you have, depending on which, if you're doing the worsted, the fine threads, or the woolen, the fuzzy threads, there's the washing of it, there's carding or combing, there's spinning, there's weaving, there's all these different steps. Some of them are chemical, some of them are physical. And he notices that at any stage of this, somebody might be undoing a step that's already happened, or they might be ruining the wool for a step that is down the line. And he is really looking at the idea of efficiency. In his writing, he does talk about it in terms of marketability and making money, but you can also tell he's kind of an exuberant guy. It's just good science, right? He's interested in just doing it well. We could do this better. We don't have to have this waste. We don't have to do and undo. We don't want to generate terrible wool. We want the good stuff. So how can we do this better? Also, one of the first people to say, hey, why doesn't anybody talk to each other? I have also found primary sources in the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1950s. My research goes to the 1960s. Hey, why don't all these groups talk to each other? The answer is, I don't know. And then, of course, the chemical and mechanical aspects of the wool. So here you see a drawing of his microscopic observations. You can see the scales, and this is what are hooking on each other if you accidentally throw a wet sweater, a wet jumper into the clothes dryer, and it comes out cat-sized or maybe even Barbie doll-sized. That's why. So he asserts that he's the first to present wool for technical purposes, acknowledging that other people have looked at wool in a microscope or have messed around with knowing that it's a keratin protein, and they've a little bit, there's not that many papers, but he wants to be the first. Also, it's over the 1800s that we get things like standardization and the development of the metric system, and that people start to agree to use the same nomenclature, right? At least among scientists, but still not between agriculture and laboratory sciences. And also agree, like, what is worth measuring? So people look at the length of the fiber, the width of the fiber. They agree to measure those largely in microns. Nobody is talking about the flavor of wool, and we're hoping it stays that way. So just to give an example of when people bring a new material into the laboratory, they'll have to agree what is important about it, not the flavor. Okay. Oh, a big fancy picture of big fancy men. So what really kickstarts this? Well, World War I, of course. The Committee for the Privy Council for Scientific and Industrial Research issues a report finding the textile industry to have, quote, even less progress in the systematic use of science, and is content, for the most part, to leave science to others. Now, this is quite a dig, and it was taken quite badly by the Textile Institute, and those papers are very enjoyable to read. That not only are they saying leaving science to others, are they saying that the textile industry had left science to others in terms of other industries in Britain? So metal, chemistry, other fields of research, but also compared to other countries, right? So they're feeling that the Germans are looking at their textiles scientifically. The Americans, the French, the Dutch are all looking at their textiles scientifically. But our textile people are not. And there are often little clips and burbs and barbs implying that wool is the most stubborn, the least interested. As we said, cotton has a certain amount of amiability with science, but wool does not. And so the response to that, as they move through the war, something that I found quite interesting. So Germany invades early August 1914. By the end of August, there are reports to the national government here that they all bought their dyes from Germany, and so there aren't any dyes to make the uniforms for the military to fight the war against Germany. So we're 2 weeks into World War I when they realize we don't have the stuff to make uniforms. So there's a big scurry in that first month of the war to get color science, color chemistry up and running in a native industry. And this is so successful that other industries then say, maybe we could have some help getting that together too. And they think, yeah, this seems like we need to be a little more independent, and we need to be able to take care of our own. Why was there such a demand for wool? Well, we have a new exciting part of warfare, trench warfare, where you have been living for months in rainy, muddy, lice-infested, rat-infested places. And British physicians decide the best approach for health and safety is to burn their uniform every month. every uniform on every British man and some British women was 12 pounds of wool. That's a lot of wool. And reports from the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, big newspapers from America, say, if we're going to do that approach, we are going to need 350 million more sheep now to keep that supply going. So people realize this, we not only are we lagging behind in science, but now, indulge me, sort of caught with our pants down, right? That we need this knowledge about wool and we don't have it. And also we need 350 million sheep. So in 1918, really at the conclusion of the war, the WIRA is incorporated, and that is here in Leeds, and that is a joint venture between the government, the University of Leeds, which coming out of the Yorkshire College of Science, the two original schools that became the University of Leeds was the medical school and the Textile Institute there. And when those two departments came together, and that was named after a few different iterations, University of Leeds. So Leeds the university has always had very strong ties to the textile industry. And there we have some fellows with sheep. Okay, so what was their stated purpose? And this was something that was come to through a lot of argument and study, although some of these are pretty vague. Investigate problems in the wool industry. Survey beneficial research, establish a library, information bureau. So that's anybody in the wool industry, from farmer to tailor, could go to them and say, I have questions. Do you have answers? And conduct sheep breeding experiments, which sounds a little sinister. What I think is quite interesting, it took me a very long time to find, was problems in the industry. And people talk around this a lot. It literally took me a year to find that shortage of wool in World War I. So a lot of the talk about the wool industry, particularly in Britain during the 19-teens, is the idea of war profiteering, that those who had wool sold it for absolutely as much as they could. And so as we head into the 1920s, wool growers were not regarded as good people. They were not regarded as patriots. And you see a lot of talk about refurbishing the image of the wool grower. So I was reading all of that for a year, and I thought, war profiteering, not a great thing, but that was the accusation. Okay, those blue marks, I don't know how to get rid of them. I'm so sorry. So what are we going to do? We have these fibers. We agree what we're going to measure, what we're going to call it, how we're going to measure, what sort of units are we going to use. We're not going to say things are like in stone and hands. No, we're going to use microns and centimeters and meters. And these physical properties, so we're looking at keratin, which is a protein and which our own nails and hair is made of that, and most things that are made of keratin behave, fairly similarly to other things made of keratin. But what does that mean in terms of dyes or of straightening or all of these other kinds of things? And then the physical properties, how long it is, how bumpy the crimp of it is, the elasticity, all these things we talked about before, plasticity. Some wool fibers are more scaly, have more scale, some have larger or smaller, and so those will felt differently. They will act differently. What is the diameter? How wide is it? And there's quite a lot of variation. And the stuff that's very fine, merino is considered really the queen of wool right now, and often merino has a micron count of around 18 to 22 microns. It's very fine. And once you get up to about 35 microns, that's the kind of stuff you don't want to put that on your baby's face. You want that in a carpet. And it does also come larger than that, but there are still applications for that wool, even if it's not baby sweater. Okay. So when we learn all these different characteristics, we can best apply them. So there are certain, as I just named, is it for clothing? Is it for carpeting? Is it for industrial? Do you want it to felt? Because sometimes you do, but sometimes you don't. Dyes, easy care, which was a big part looking through the Marks and Spencer archives, which are on the Leeds campus. They had their own textile research institute in the Marks and Spencer system, which I found amazing. And big questions were about the things you think. I don't want it to felt. I don't want it to be eaten by moths. And a big one for quite a long time is, how do I get a permanent pleat? I need those pleats to stay there. There's a lot of research on how to achieve that. But people want easy, convenient clothing because they want to look nice without all this time. Now, what's also quite interesting is that Marks and Spencer, if you look at their advertising, they'll say, we always sold the finest wool. We didn't give up the ghost for synthetics. Wool stays as a product for the wealthy people, right? Because wool needs care. And do wealthy people care for their own clothing? Probably not. Either they have in-house domesticated service or they can take it to a dry cleaner, right? But if you are washing your own clothes, maybe by hand, you don't have time for that. The world is moving on. After World War II, there's a huge push towards synthetic and easy care fabrics. And now we're starting to see the price we're paying for that decision. Okay, moving on to insulation, fire resistance, water resistance and wicking, mold and odor resistance. There's it's one of these internet challenges where you can wear a wool garment without washing it. Now, you do have to air it out, but it is resistant to odor. So even a very fine wool, like an undershirt or a t-shirt, will smell better, certainly than a polyester one, of course. But you don't have to wash wool as much. It's durable, but it also does biodegrade, unlike any plastic. Okay, so what does that mean? All right, why am I interested in this? What was the motivation? 92 million tons of textiles are landfilled every year. 60% of all of our clothing is made from petroleum. Most of that is polyester. There's also some nylon, acrylic, and then other kinds of plastics that are similar polymers and have fancier names. These release 500,000 tons of microplastic into water, soil, human, and animal bloodstreams. Very recent research, even just this past month, The Guardian has published that microplastics, as I mentioned, they do go through the placenta barrier. They are found in the blood. They are found in 50 times the amount in people with dementia than those without dementia. They are found in testicles. They are found in breast milk. Some of these plastics can mirror hormone chemical structures. And so people are looking at how, if we have blood systems from birth, from before birth, full of plastics, how is that affecting? Largely, people are looking at reproductive systems and also the highly malleable, changeable systems like the brain, lungs, liver, places where things collect. So that's pretty important. So my assertion, the large application of my thesis, is that rediscovering these facts from wool science and applying to modern textiles, that we can still produce high performance textiles. We can support our ranchers and wool producers to, at the very least, cover their shearing costs without tons of waste, many of them going to developing nations. There are certain heaps of clothing that you can see from outer space. So we wouldn't have not only the discarded clothing, but these microfibers in the systems, the microplastics. or supporting the petroleum industry. Now, only about 1.3, 1.5% of petroleum goes into textiles right now. But it still is a lot of money. So I don't think we need to support them anymore. So just a little reminder that historians know sustainable practices so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Thank you. So curious. No, okay. Okay.
Be online, we did that.
I think you can get rid of the little green pen icon at the bottom left.
We learn new things every day about Zoom, I tell you. Oh, this guy.
If you click that,
Annotate.
you might be able to turn. Yeah, there you go. There's a little rubber sign.
This guy.
Yeah, I think so.
Sure. Yes. Thank you to the man in front. All right.
I hate my students doing it when I learned that during lockdown when I was lecturing online, my students could annotate my lecture slides. Sometimes with various rude things.
Well, one time I did have a student when they knock on your door and they say such and so is waiting to enter your Zoom room, and one of my darling students wrote, "Your worst nightmare." Oh, they're so much fun. Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
Questions.
Yeah, if anybody has questions, I will certainly do my best. Hello, hi.
So what was the solution in the First World War when you were saying that they needed all these millions of sheep and they needed this huge supply of uniforms?
What I do know is that people talked a lot about recycling wool, which because wool does have those scales, it can recycle better than other fabrics. The sources I have seen so far say the Germans must be recycling because they don't have enough sheep to keep using virgin wool. There were also writings about in American military saying we're going to have to start blending cotton in with the wool, and huge arguments in Congress about that because, of course, if you are living in a dirt hole in Belgium, that cotton, as I mentioned, is gonna be very cold, and you increase the risk of hypothermia death. So I don't think they found 350 million sheep. I haven't found out quite yet what it is. I do believe there's similar kinds of collections of materials, like people donated their copper pots or they collected fats. But that is one of the things that really jumpstarts the synthetic fiber. In particular, one thing that really motivated nylon was the idea of parachutes. You want a strong, lightweight fabric, and the poor little silkworms just couldn't keep up with demand because all parachutes were made from silk. And of course, World War I being the first airborne war. So I'm still looking, I guess, is the very short answer. But I know they got them working on synthetics. They looked at recycling. They looked at blending with other fibers. My guess is that at some point they just stopped burning the uniforms, just because it's not sustainable. So that's a guess.
I guess they did, because we know that there were great problems with lice in the trenches, don't we?
Yeah.
Yep.
Not direct evidence, but indication.
Yes. Yeah.
Uniform.
Oh, yes, Christine.
You mentioned about recycling. If I can look to the shoddy industry then, that's basically due to be in this area.
Yes. I go on, started calling them field trips. I went to a couple of mills last week, actually. I went to Bronte Glen and I went to Edward Clay. Does that sound right? That sounds right. And to look at how you can break apart. A lot of it actually is clothing. They buy clothing from resellers, often they're charity shops, and you can. What's so interesting to me is they have these machines that sort of tear them apart, but tear them apart in a very controlled way, because you need enough length of fiber to be able to turn it back into yarn. If you just shred it into fluff, then you just have fluff. And I think that's very exciting. Wool only makes up about 0.5% of our clothing. So post-market recycling is not a huge worry, really. Some of the applications I'm looking at are pre-consumer waste. So if you cut out your Burberry coat and there's the remnants, what do you do with that? So now mills in this area are going to the like the tailoring shops and collecting that waste, and they can turn that back into yarn and or weave that back into fabric. Of course, shoddy, at least in America, it doesn't have a good connotation. In fact, nobody I know knows that shoddy meant anything good ever. And it is just recycled wool. And also mungo is a different process, but also recycled wool. So I think we'd need a new name for it in America, but I see huge applications for recycling wool. Many of them do blend with a little bit of new wool or virgin wool, and sadly enough, about 10% nylon, which is for strength, but still 90% wool is better than 60% polyester.
Really interesting, fascinating, lots of stuff there I had no idea about, but when you talk about it, it all makes perfect sense. What you didn't
Thank you.
what you didn't mention was the ecological impact of the sheep industry, because that has been really drastic wherever sheep have rocked up.
Yes, it's interesting because during my transfer meeting, which is the big checkpoint after your first year, one of the readers literally got onto the idea of kangaroos, and I thought, I don't know how we got to kangaroos. I mean, I do. There are a lot of issues with any sort of industrial sized farming, and whether that is synthetic fertilizers or crops, or dealing with the animal waste and animal welfare of ranching. I personally would love to see smaller farms, more family-based farms, better application of natural resources. Like, what's interesting to me as a historian, we know how to do this stuff sustainably. We just refuse to. So we put synthetic fertilizers on our land, and then it all washes into the water, and then people wonder why there's a problem. I don't think that the big industrial farms that are a lot of places
Is it just the numbers
are a good idea. Like, I think you just get to a certain a break point of like, this isn't actually sustainable. This is capitalism at its worst.
Is it just the numbers game? Because as you mentioned earlier, when we were talking about what sheep actually do like to eat, because they are quite selective, and they eat all the palatable stuff, which leaves you with millennia and Nardus deserts. To coin a phrase from George Monbiot,
Yes,
the sheep wrecked upland.
It's much of that is beyond what I know and what I'm studying. I mean, I know that there are problems. One small answer to that, which I find quite charming, and also in the America West, you may have heard that we have problems with wildfires, is that at least in my hometown, there are two professional, these are goat herds who are a little bit less picky, but they hire the goat herds to come eat down all of the scrub so that the fire doesn't get big enough to burn down the trees. And I think that's fantastic. Also, they're super cute. Now, not everybody has the option to like cart their sheep around to reduce wildfire. But I just have to think, for as long as people have been raising sheep for wool, it literally is sustainable if you do it in a certain way. And it isn't until the 1930s, at least in America, when you start getting super industrialized farming with big machines and somewhat big farms buying out all the smaller farms and becoming these mega farms, do you really have these problems? So maybe they need to be broken up. I'm sure I'm going to get fan mail on that. Yes, sir.
Just wondering how recent you're going in your history. My business partner, who I hoped was going to turn up online, but has been otherwise engaged. She's ended up with part of an archive from a wool researcher in Huddersfield.
Really?
So I think that goes into the early 80s.
My thesis itself, I decided to go up to 1965. One of the big researchers at Leeds, John Speakman, if you've been on campus, you may see an auditorium is named after John Speakman. He was a chemist and did a lot of PR about wool and learning to work with synthetics and looking at their properties. And his later writings do get a bit sad. You see him acknowledging like the loss of the market of wool and that it really in the 1960s was switching over to the synthetics. His last year at the university was 1964 and his last publications were in 1965. And so that really in many ways was kind of the end of an era in wool science. So it gets established, but then people just don't want to wear wool anymore. So that's the thesis research, but I'm always interested to know, well, everything. So I'd love to get your information.
I'm thinking that you presumably met the Gaunts and the Hainsworths and the Moons.
I know of them. I have gone to the Moon half price sale, which was wonderful. I have tried to contact the Hainsworth a couple of times. I don't get a great response.
William Gaunt was giving a talk the other night in Leeds. And they kept on with their mill until 2008.
Oh, okay.
And he studied textiles at the University of Leeds.
Fantastic.
He's a weaver. He still calls himself.
Yeah,
a weaver,
okay.
doesn't he?
No, that's good to know.
So there's still sort of living memory.
Right. Well, and I do know I read the book that a professor, she's now retired from Leeds, Regina Blachuk, just wrote a book about Abraham Moon as a mill, and it's I understand. That what was so interesting about that, and I was just chatting earlier, is one of the reasons the Abraham Moon, which is one of the early mills, is still in business, is that they asked people what they wanted. And many of the mills would say, well, we've been making that for 200 years. If you don't like it, don't buy it. And then people didn't. And they say, why am I going out of business? Whereas Abraham Moon went to their customers and said, well, what do you want? And people said, we like these colors. We like these patterns. We like this texture. And Abraham Moon said, we can do that. And so they did. And even now, I advise everybody just go there and pet things. But they have such brilliant colors and patterns. I found them to be you can, of course, always get very traditional stuff. Everybody's always got the traditional Tweety stuff in the back. But wool can be very, very progressive and modern. So I think that's quite interesting. I've been told about the Gott family that I need. Their papers are in the special collections, but yeah.
And the other thing is that Hainsworth is said to have invented khaki because of our links with India, where khaki was actually the Hainsworths were the ones who applied that colour to woolen cloth in the First World War, I believe. Do you know that, Christine? Yeah, so I interviewed Adam Hainsworth for our book on innovation in Leeds.
Oh,
and
fantastic.
He told me that story, so it's probably true.
Asterisks. Yeah. Any other?
And just another,
Yeah.
like a side issue, you said about the profiteering in the First World War. Do you know the war memorial in the university that's in the Rupert Beckett building? Just in the entrance there, which is very controversial in all sorts of ways, by a very controversial sculptor called Eric Gill. And it's Christ ejecting the money changers from the temple. And it's said to be his critical comment on Leeds having coined it during the First World War through uniforms, boots, and munitions.
Yeah.
And all of that. You know, Leeds lost thousands of men, and there's an amazing story on that side as well. But
Certainly, yeah.
That was the critical side of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, that was just
Thank you. Yeah, no, I
enriching your story too much.
you know, that actually has been the problem. I have 2 master's degrees, one in musicology and one in history, but both of them are based on specific documents. So I analyze those documents and the secondary sources, and so it's very tidy and self-contained. So this is the first time I've done postgraduate study on a field, and it's very overwhelming. And you come here and you meet all these lovely people that like, oh, I can tell you a whole bunch of stuff, and it's kind of like drinking from a fire hose, as they say. I actually have to tell my supervisors to pause them, you know, like a crossing guard, stop, so that I can write it all down. That's been my biggest challenge, is actually narrowing it down to a 200-page document that I can complete in another year and a half. There's just too much to know.
Tables and appendices.
You're so smart.
Nice. Shall I take your place?
Sure. Yes. So,
Finished?
yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Monica, for sharing your knowledge with us, and for giving us such a lively and interesting lecture tonight. And I think you're really on a exciting and interesting journey with all this. It sounds fantastic.